Last week, President Biden announced a plan to address rising crime rates across the country.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki had this to say on the matter. Let's take a look.
Today, the Biden-Harris administration is announcing a comprehensive strategy to combat violent crime and gun violence that targets the crime itself. Combined, this plan will stem the flow of firearms used to commit violence, including by holding rogue firearm dealers accountable for violating federal laws, support local law enforcement with federal tools and resources to help address violent crime, invest in evidence-based community violence interventions, expand summer programming, employment opportunities, and other services, and support for teenagers and young adults, and help formerly incarcerated individuals successfully re-enter their communities.
We have new exclusive Hill Harris X data to gauge voters' thoughts on crime in their area. We asked, has crime in your community gotten better, worse, or stayed about the same over the past 12 months?
The poll found 60% of voters say crime in their community has stayed about the same over the last 12 months, 23% say it's gotten worse, and 17% say it's gotten better. While a majority of voters living in all locales say crime has stayed about the same, there are some interesting splits. 41% of urban voters say crime has gotten better, while 30% of suburban voters and 27% of rural voters say crime has gotten worse.
According to Axios, the GOP plans to emphasize Democratic vulnerabilities, including crime and immigration, heading into 2022. Emily, what's your take on the data here and what that means for the midterm contests?
You know, it's interesting to see the perception split, because I would guess that if you look at the numbers, it's actually urban locales that have seen rises in crime here in Washington, D.C., and rises in particular types of crime. And so the fact that suburban voters and rural voters are sort of perceiving a crime increase is really interesting. I don't actually know what level of crime increases many of those communities have actually seen. I'm sure it differs regionally, where there have been betterings and where there have been things that have gotten worse. I'm sure that difference that happens regionally, and those are important. That's important nuance. But the perception issue, at least, is very interesting.
And it does seem like there's a gap between the media narrative about about soaring crime rates producing a backlash, and what you're actually seeing on the ground and what you see in these numbers. You see a significant number of well into a majority of people saying, no, actually, things are just the same as they were, or they're actually getting better.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because things were getting better, I think, early in COVID, right? So like early, certain type of things. And again, crime, using that sort of catch-all, is not necessarily always productive, because when you break it down, it's different kinds of crime. There's drugs, there's violence, and you can sort of go theft, and you can go down the line, and things are happening differently in different places. But that's why it's useful, I think, as a gauge of perception. And so in early days of COVID, when everyone was locked up and things were quiet, it's easy to understand why people had the perception that things were getting better. And then as we headed into the summer, I think it was easy for people to fall into the perception that things were getting worse. And clearly, in some places, things were indeed getting worse. 40% of urban Americans in this poll saying it's gotten better. That's a fascinating number.
It really is. And to pick up on that, check this out. So not only is it 41% saying that crime has gotten better, but then you have 51% saying it's the same. So do some quick math here. 92% of people living in urban areas are telling a pollster that over the past year, crime has either gotten the same or things have gotten better, whereas only 8% are saying things have gotten worse. And then interestingly, you have 30% of suburbanites and 27% of rural people saying that it has gotten worse. That doesn't mean that crime has gotten worse in the suburbs or in rural areas, but maybe it's that they think crime has gotten worse in urban areas. But you ask the people in the urban areas, and they're like, no.
Yeah,
it's actually about the same.
And when breaking down polls, it's so important to look at exactly how that question was asked. Has crime in your community gotten better or worse? So it's not even that they're projecting sort of nationally; they're saying their own communities. And what would be a really fascinating breakdown would be to overlay the people who think crime has gotten better by region, and then what has actually happened in that region. That would be really, really interesting. I mean, a great example: there were 2 shootings here in D.C. in the last 24 hours, with one occurring just this morning before 10 a.m. on U Street, not far from here. In New York City yesterday, around 5 p.m., an active shooter opened fire in Times Square. So we've seen certain types of crime absolutely getting worse in certain cities, and in very, very disturbing and vivid ways. The carjackings here in DC are increasing. Remember the one carjacking of the Uber driver by the two teenagers? It resulted in his murder. Horrific video to have to watch. But why do you think it is? How does that square with the 41% number?
Well, the number of shootings and the number of murders is definitely going up. But if they're asking about crime in general,
right,
you're not seeing increases in crime rates, in particularly. That the fact that that a quarter of rural people are saying that crime is getting worse may in fact be a function of the opioid epidemic, just not abating at all, and in fact picking up during the pandemic. And so it shows that yes, there have been a lot of high profile murders, and there have been more murders, but people for whatever reason in this poll are saying that no, that crime is about the same, because when people think of crime, I think they're thinking about burglaries, break-ins, violent crime, not specifically necessarily about the murder rate. You're recently starting to see Democrats kind of put out a new talking point on this, which is that I think Cedric Richmond was making this point for the White House recently, saying, look, Republicans say that they want to fight crime. They won't touch anything when it comes to gun control or gun safety. And the reason we're having more shootings is that there are more guns on the street over the past year. Do you think that has any chance of boxing Republicans in on that position? Because in the 90s, you had a lot of cops who were for the assault weapons ban. One of the biggest lobbies for the assault weapons ban was the police. Now the police have polarized around the question of the Second Amendment and are deeply hostile to any efforts to do that.
I mean, the definition of assault weapon continues to get murkier and murkier, and again, it's definition inflation depending on who's using it. Guns is it's an interesting topic in this context, because I would venture to guess that the majority of guns being used in some of these increased crimes are not legal to begin with, and so the question of what much more regulation would do is different. It reminds me of what you just said on the opioid epidemic actually worsening over the course of the pandemic. People expected, for instance, suicides, sadly, to increase during the pandemic. Early indications are that it actually plateaued, but overdoses spiked. And so there are some of these really, really like roots deep issues that I think were exacerbated by the pandemic that may not be translating into what people think about as crime in the sort of catch-all phraseology, but have certainly impacted some communities so detrimentally. Yeah,
for sure. And we'll see whether or not Republicans end up feeling any pressure on that, because I'm sure you're right that a lot of the gun possession is illegal. Some of it, no doubt, is also legal. Then the question becomes, okay, if it is illegal, then let's legislate and regulate some enforcement policy that doesn't exist now, because clearly we have all of these illegal guns. Let's figure out how to enforce the laws around these illegal guns. And I think you'll have the NRA in that situation be like, well, wait a minute, let's not do that either.
Well, the NRA isn't very a potent force anymore, period. They're bankrupt and struggling. So I don't think the NRA would have much of a say at all in what happens on that at this point. But anyway, this is one of those issues where there's so many layers that you just kind of keep going down and peeling back, and you realize how screwed we are in so many different ways.
No doubt about that.
Well, tomorrow on Rising, Ben Burgess joins us to discuss his new book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the New Left.
President of the Association of Flight Attendants, Sarah Nelson, will also be here. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Have a great Monday.